Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. This week on the GardenDC podcast, we're talking to Barry Glick. Barry is a columnist for our Washington Gardener magazine on native plants, and his column is Going Native, but he is well known in the gardening world worldwide for many things, and welcome, Barry. And one of them is for being a Hellebore expert, which is what we're going to talk about today. But before we dive into that, we're going to talk about you, Barry, for a little bit and your plant journey and how you became transplanted from Philadelphia to Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Welcome, Barry.
Hi, Kath. Well, first of all, let's get something straight here. I don't like the word expert. It sets up too much expectation from people, and I can't handle that. So I'm not an expert. I'm a geek about plants, and so let's substitute the word geek for expert. Let's leave the experts that terminology for guys with a PhD.
Done. So we'll call you the Hellebore geek or plant nerd.
There you go. That's perfect. Perfect. I fit into that category very well.
So you're saying you don't have a doctorate in horticulture. What is your degree in?
Geez, I was a child of the 60s growing up in the streets of Philadelphia. I didn't go to college except for night school for photography, and I do get lots of compliments on the photographs on my website, so I guess that paid off.
Yeah, it's definitely an asset for such a visual occupation as plants. And you would say maybe that you had a degree in experiences of life.
On the job training.
Yes, definitely on the job training, and of course the equivalent in experience. And so you were a city kid to start off with?
Yes.
Were you always into plants? Were you a houseplant collector?
Well, here's the backstory. My father used to go out drinking with his buddies on Sunday, and one day when I was 5 years old, well, I mean, they could sell him anything. He used to bring home tape recorders, transistor radios, little televisions, and one day he brought home a 6-pack of tomatoes, a 6-pack of carnations, and a pack of radish seeds, and I could just say the rest is history. But that's the radishes are really what excited me the most, because we got lots of great radishes, and then some of them bolted and formed these really strange-looking seed pods. And I said to my mother, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, I think they're seed pods." And I saved the seeds and planted them next year. Of course, being F1 hybrids, they didn't come quite true, but they were delicious edible radishes. And I said to my mother, "I don't think I'm ever going to have to buy food again." So it worked out pretty good, and I am definitely what you would call a seed freak. I love collecting seeds from plants. I like hybridizing and making seeds. And we put out in the Hellebore patch alone, and when I say patch, I'm talking about 6 acres, and we're only collecting seeds in a quarter acre because we collect about 150,000 seeds a year. And we put these 4x6, 5x8, and 6x10 polyester seed bags. They have to breathe. A lot of people start out putting little Ziploc bags and other things over the seed heads so they don't miss the seeds, because you can go from having a green, ripe Hellebore seed pod, and I'm just using Hellebores as an example. When you go to sleep that night and wake up the next morning and it's brown and the seeds have already fallen out, and then good luck trying to pick them out with a pair of 10-inch forceps out of the mulch under the plant or leaf litter or whatever you have there. So we put on these seed bags, and it turns out the seed bags are mill-spun polyester, which lasts for years and years and years because they're ultraviolet stabilized, but unfortunately the drawstrings on the seed bags are made of cotton, so they rot. So we use a clothespin, a spring-loaded clothespin, to hold them closed so the seeds don't fall out. And it looks like snow in July because in February, March, and April, and May we're pollinating, and in June we put the seed bags on. July we collect the seed bags and clean the seeds from it's the proverbial wheat from the chaff in what's called a clipper fanning mill, and it separates out all the leaf particles and dust, and you're bound to get all kinds of insects crawling into the bags. And after going through 2 different size screens that vibrate, at the bottom comes out of the chute pure, beautiful Hellebore seeds, which are about the size and shape of rice, except they're black, and that's the treasure. Then we sow them 5,000 to a 17 by 17, 5-inch deep Anderson propagation flat. We put a piece of hardware cloth over the top of it to keep the varmints out. And right now they're germinating beautifully. In fact, on my Facebook page today, I just put a picture of one of the seed trays germinating, and a caption was, "The eggs are finally hatching." So looks pretty cool. I love all those little cotyledons.
So you said 5,000 in a 17 by 17 tray. How many of those seeds germinate?
Well, probably well more than half germinate the first year. The rest of them germinate the second year. So we're really careful about saving. In fact, I never throw away seed trays because things could germinate several years down the line. I remember how I found that out, and it was with a native plant called Actia pachypoda. Actia pachypoda is doll's eyes, or wolfbane. And what I did, I remember finding a half a dozen plants in the woods up the holler from here, and collected the seeds, and it couldn't have worked out more beautifully. I was sowing them in a 288 cell seed tray, and I had 288 seeds from these 6 plants. I just, I couldn't believe it. So I sowed them and put them out in the woods. So Mother Nature took its course, because I was taught many, many years ago by one of the most brilliant people in the Rock Garden Society, who's long gone. His name was Norman C. Dino, middle initial C, Dino, D-E-N-O, who wrote a book on propagation from seed theory and practice, and covered 2,000 species. The book has been reprinted. I think it's on on Amazon. You can find it. Norman C. Dino. And I used to get dot matrix computer printouts from Norm while he was editing the book before he even published it. And I remember calling him and telling him, I said, I had these Aquilegia seeds, and I had them under lights at 70 degrees, the optimum temperature, I thought, and they didn't germinate. And I know I collected them fresh. And he said, no, you have to replicate nature. And that's the simplest thing. It's not rocket science. The seeds needed freezing and thawing. They needed to be where they would be out in the wild, freezing and thawing in nature. And what that does, that makes little minute cracks in the seed coat, and eventually water is absorbed, and the plants know that the temperature has warmed up and is steady and stable, and that it's time to germinate. Now, there are certain seeds that need a little bit of help beyond that, mostly seeds of the Leguminacy family, which have a really, really hard seed coat and could be years before they germinate. Now, you can help that along by, and I realize we got far away from the Actia pachypoda seeds, so I'll get back to that in a second. And where was I? Okay, so Leguminacy seeds, you can take the seed and where it was attached to the plant on that end of the seed, rub it on an emery board and kind of pierce the coat so water gets in right away. Or you could take them and shake them in a vial of coarse sand. Now, getting back to the Actia pachypoda, and I can't believe that as obsessive compulsive ADHD that I am, that I remembered where I left off. Give me a second to get my bearings in the story. So I put the seed flat, the 288 cell seed flat, out in the woods, and the following spring, expecting 288 seedlings because I know I collected the seeds fresh, I got nothing, not a zip, zed, nothing. So I left it out there because I had so many other things happening. My philosophy is, since a watched pot never boils, you have a lot of pots and there's always something boiling because you can't be watching them all. So I put it out in the woods, and then lo and behold, the following year, the second year, I had 288 little seedlings. So what those particular seeds had to go through was 2 cycles of warmth and cold. So basically what I've done, if I want to germinate seeds like that, I'll put them in moist moss or vermiculite, put them in the refrigerator for 6 weeks, bring them out into room temperature for 6 weeks, put them back in the refrigerator for 6 weeks, and bring them out, and in 6 weeks they usually germinate. And this is a kind of a steadfast rule across the board for things that require 2 cycles of warmth and cold. So you're actually kind of tricking Mother Nature there. I'm sure she knows what's going on, but she turns the other cheek to let us shave some time off, since our lives are kind of finite and limited, and she wants us to enjoy all the amazing plants that she's created.
I love that description. And so that cold freeze thaw process that you described, that some seeds require, not all seeds, that technical term is cold stratification, correct?
Well, then the word stratification is a misnomer as well, because
Hmm.
stratification just means layering in. So it's conditioning. I like the word conditioning better.
Yes, that makes more sense. But often on seed packs or directions, you might see the term stratification. So you would know that that means it has to go through some type of winter exposure, whether you're creating it artificially or actually doing it
Right,
for a whole
right.
season.
Exactly. I'm a stickler for nomenclature and
Hmm.
terminology. So, well, I just call it conditioning.
And clarity always helps. And speaking of terminology, I notice you don't have a West Virginia accent, even though you've been there since the early 70s. But you referred to the holler down the road. Can you define that for us city folks?
Well, most city folks would call it a hollow, HOLLOW. There's a whole, if you Google hillbilly terminology, you'll find a description. Let's see, I'll do that while we're chatting here. Hillbilly terminology. Hillbilly terminology. Uh, Hillbilly terminology. Let's see. Hillbilly's looks like it's a derogatory term, but we don't mind it. We
Yeah, it can be
uh,
used, I think, in several ways. But was your transition from Philadelphia to West Virginia? Did you have to learn a new vocabulary? And what drew you to that piece of land? What
well,
about it?
yeah, geez, I I attribute my success to naivety and being green or wet behind the ears. There are many different ways to describe it. Moving down here from growing up in a row house where there were 40 houses on each side of the street in the early 70s, to land that I had no idea what I was doing, and I can catalog all my mistakes, but I learned from them, and I made lots of mistakes, but I rarely made the same ones twice. Now, I just happened to be sitting in a friend's living room waiting for them to get together whatever they needed to head down to Atlantic City for the afternoon, and was flipping through the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I actually have the ad. There it is up on my wall, laminated. And in the farms for sale section, because I always wanted a farm or farmland, and in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, they were $3,000 an acre. And this said, remote mountain farm, 60 acres. Well, actually, it said 58 acres, 40 pole, 10 rod, more or less. There are different ways of measuring land, or smaller pieces. And so basically it was 60 acres for $6,000. I said, wow, that must be a misprint. But I called the guy anyway, and I'm still in touch with him. He was kind of a land speculator, lived in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So I drove out to visit him, and he showed me some slides and drew a map on a paper bag, threw the dogs into a van thinking, well, West Virginia is only 4 hours away. And after about 8 hours of driving, and you don't know what it's like driving a 1961 Volkswagen bus on Interstate 81. Oh, my God. I ended up here. It turned out that the panhandle of West Virginia, the eastern part, which we consider a suburb of D.C., is 4 hours from Philadelphia. The real part of West Virginia where I live, Greenbrier County, the mountains, is 7.5 hours. But back then it was 8 hours because Interstate 64 wasn't finished. And there was a mountain pass between Covington and White Sulphur Springs that if you got behind a tractor trailer, you just moped along at 5 miles an hour, breathing in diesel fumes. So it was tough. It was tough. And then, building a house from scratch where you were sleeping and the snow was blowing in between the cracks of the plywood, and you ran out of firewood, so you're out there with a chainsaw, which you just learned how to use, at midnight, cutting up your split rail fence to keep the fire going. It's just the tip of the iceberg. But it's been a wild ride, and it's pretty interesting.
And the first crop you started growing was?
Is it legal? It's still not legal in West Virginia, but I think it is up where you are.
In parts.
Yeah. Yes, it was a lucrative medicinal crop. Had palmate leaves. And nobody down here knew what it was. So with that money from that, I really expanded and ended up in the lumber business, and that led to the hot tub business. And I ended up trading hot tubs and whirlpool baths to different nurserymen for nursery stock, and that's how I started the nursery. And then realized that there was a demand for native plants, and realized, I said, oh my God, they're so easy to propagate and they grow all around me. I live in one of the most botanically rich areas in the world. I mean, the flora of West Virginia is 1,089 pages. It's 3 inches thick and covers over 2,500 species. It was last updated in 1976 by Earl Core and P.D. Strasbaugh, who were real wildflower guys, and they were friends of Edgar T. Werry, who lived up your way, who had a journal, a little newsletter, pamphlet in the 50s about wildflowers. In fact, there's a plant named for him, Tiarella werryi. And these guys were the epitome of plant nerds. I mean, they knew native plants, where they grew, and it was amazing. And all their literature, actually, Edgar T. Werry wrote a book on the genus Phlox and other plants in the Polemoniaceae family, but primarily Phlox, which was written in the 50s, which is still, except for some of the antiquated nomenclature, still considered the only reference source for the genus Phlox.
And back then, they were called wildflowers. I don't think that the term native plants was being used commonly.
Not, I don't think so. I think that they were considered wildflowers. That was the term. They're still considered wildflowers because they're not hybridized. Although it's interesting, the guy, what was his name, Tradescan, who sent our native plants back to King George, and they ended up in England and Germany, and they took plants like our Phlox paniculata and our plants like Tradescantia virginiana, which was named after Tradescan, and they started hybridizing them over there. And there's probably about 50 Phlox paniculata that were bred in Germany from the plants that James Tradescan sent back to King George.
Wow. And so that's one big part of your business, correct, is propagating from wild collected seed or seeds that you're
Yeah,
propagating,
yes,
obviously.
I really like to preserve genetic diversity by propagating by seed. If you do plants from cuttings, there's really no genetic diversity there. And if there should be a disease on a particular plant that affects maybe 10% of the population, then that one plant, that all the plants that are made from that plant, propagated vegetatively either by cuttings or division or tissue culture, they're all going to be susceptible to that disease. Whereas if you're growing from seeds from that population, only 10% of the plants are going to be susceptible to that disease. So we like to think that by propagating from seed, we are preserving genetic diversity.
Hmm. And for most of what you're growing and selling, you're doing it by mail order these days, correct?
Yeah, I still get lots of visitors here, and I love visitors. I've had people here from virtually every country in the world, every at least first world country in the world. And I like the byline that you gave me in the magazine, that my garden is a mecca. I like that term.
And I wanted to also ask you about your online business. So it's Sunshine Farm and Gardens, and that's the name of your property. What brought about that name?
Oh, well, let's see. The first night I was here, a friend of mine gave me some orange sunshine LSD, and I saw the meaning of life in a rock. And again, I'll have to say the rest is history. So
Okay.
it became Sunshine Farm and Gardens.
Hmm. And of course, because we're having our main talk today about hellebores, we probably do need to define that they are not native to the United States,
Well,
but
that's
that's.
what I was going to say. They are
Mm-hmm.
every plant is native somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and the hellebores are native to mainland Europe, but primarily all the species hellebores, most of them are native to the Balkans, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia. That things like Hellebore purpurescens, viridis. I think viridis occurs in England. Hellebore Fetidis is in the British Isles, besides being native all over Europe. So this is a good time to mention that in the old days, in the early times of hellebores, they were referred to as Hellebore Orientalis, which is kind of a misnomer because what they basically are is a compendium, or let's say a hybrid of hybrids. For example, Hellebore purpurescens brings a purplish color. Hellebore viridis brings a green color. Hellebore multifidus brings a divided foliage. Hellebore multifidus subspecies striacus brings a really divided foliage. There is actually a species, Helleborus Orientalis, which has two subspecies. The regular Helleborus Orientalis, which is also from the Caucasus, actually, has two subspecies. One is subspecies guttatus, which brings that beautiful red spotting to the white background of color, and Helleborus Orientalis subspecies abchasicus, which brings a reddish early flowering plant to the palate. So when you see all these different colored hellebores, they're now known as Hellebores ex hybridis. And it could be any one of them, infinite color, shape, and form. I mean, even the foliage is variable. So you could look at it, and if it's leaning into the really purple colors, saying, oh, it's got a big influence from Hellebore purpurescens, or if it's more greenish, then it's Hellebore viridis has more of an influence on it. One of the most desirable colors in hellebores and one of the most elusive is Helleborus odoris, which brings a yellow color to the mix. But Helleborus odoris is kind of a weak grower, so the plants aren't as vigorous as some of the rest of the colors.
And I would think that most gardeners who might not be using their Latin would be referring to hellebores by their two bloom times, either the Christmas rose or the Lenten rose.
Exactly. And what we're talking about so far has been the Lenten rose. If you want to talk about the Christmas rose, we're talking about one particular genus or species, rather, in the genus Hellebores, and that's Hellebores niger. And they have white flowers that flower around Christmas. Now, you may wonder why it has the specific epithet niger, which means black in Latin, when the flowers are white. Well,
Yeah, that always confused me.
the roots
Yeah.
are black. The roots are black, and
Ah,
they were used medicinally, even though most of the plants in the Ranunculaceae family, which is the buttercup family, most of the plants in that genus are poisonous to some degree. And people worry, oh, I don't want to grow hellebores because my dogs will die. I said, well, I had 5 dogs at that when I started growing them, and no dog would eat a hellebore because they're bitter and acrid. I mean, that's why the deer don't eat them. They have a principle in them that protects them. And yes, if you sat down and pretended they were spinach and made a wonderful salad with Kalamata olives, put a little olive oil and balsamic vinegar on it, you still wouldn't be able to eat it because they taste terrible. I've taken a bite out of them. And I've always had the desire and never got around to it. It's project number 802 on my list of things to do, is take the leaves of hellebores. Maybe one of your listeners or readers will beat me to it and become famous and wealthy. And take the leaves of hellebores and put them in a blender with water and or alcohol or something, see if I could extract the principle that makes them deer proof in the leaves, and spray it on other plants like Trilliums or Hepaticas, which the deer love. Or if you really want to do a test, spray it on daylilies and hostas and see if we can make a mixture that is like strong as liquid fence or one of the other deer away or hinder or one of these other deer sprays. And
mm-hmm.
that way you could cut your hellebore leaves off in the fall and make this brew to use in the spring. So anybody does that, let me know.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting experiment, and you'll have plenty of foliage in your garden to try it out with. And
Well,
for
with 6
those,
acres of hellebores, I could bale this stuff up.
yes. So, do you remove the spent foliage at the beginning of winter, at the end of winter? How do you take care of yours?
Funny you should ask, and that's the one of the beginning slides in my hellebore lecture is what a bed of hellebores looks like in early spring, not cleaned up, and the next photo of the same bed is a couple days later, cleaned up with all the old foliage taken off. And there's no way in the world, even with an army of fellow plant nerds with Felco number 7 or number 2 pruners, or even hedge trimmers, could we cut off all the old foliage. And people say, well, doesn't it cause disease to have the old foliage on there? I said, no, of course not. Not unless there's disease to start with or something. No. In fact, I believe that leaving the old foliage on protects the crown of the plant because it's like it has like a vase-like foliage and leaves collect in it. So you have like automatic mulching to protect the crown of the plant, maybe delay flowering until all the hard freezes are over with. Then they decompose and add organic matter to the soil.
Great points. And yeah, I would say if it was really tattered or if there was a, ice storm and it looked really awful, that it's not going to be horrible for the plant to cut off some
Well,
of the spent foliage.
I'm talking about having 6 acres of them to deal
Mhm.
with. In the early days, when it was just a quarter acre, they were beautifully mulched, well fed, and pruned and deadheaded. Uh, but in the home garden, there's nothing wrong with. I mean, I would wait till right before they were ready to flower to cut the foliage off, because at that point, hopefully, all the hard freezes are over with. But certainly, the couple beds right around my house in my own gardens, we try to clean up just for display purposes. Yeah.
Hmm. And for those not growing hellebore, which I can't even imagine, let's sell them on them, Barry. So let's talk all the attributes and benefits of the hellebore. So first off, evergreen, right?
Yes. Well, that's kind of a misnomer as well. Uh, Here in Zone 5, they can get, well, let's say this. Okay. We consider them shade plants, but in their native habitats, they're really meadow forbs. They grow in meadows, and the meadow grasses and forbs come up and shield them from the sun as the season comes on. In the early spring, late winter, early spring, the sun isn't that strong, but later on, they need a little protection. If you grow them in full shade, which I do because I have, out of 60 acres here, about 45 acres are deep shade woodland. The foliage looks great all year round until it's ready to be replaced by the old foliage, kind of pushes it out of the way. Now I have several beds, and I'm looking out the window at them in full sun, and they get the morning, noon, and evening sun. I mean, the late afternoon sun is brutal on them, and they look phenomenal. And in the early spring, they produce more flowers than the ones grown in the shade. And for division purposes, they produce more underground growth than the ones in the deep shade. But come the end of July, the foliage starts getting a little burnt and beat up and tattered.
So we're going to call them as evergreen as a herbaceous plant could probably be, right? And certainly deer proof, which we've already established. And then they have several months of bloom when most everything else is not blooming. So late winter into early spring.
Yeah, the flowers just hang on, and even as they fade, even as the color fades, they take on this pastel look to them. And a lot of people, in fact, one fellow, a very good friend of mine, Bob Woolham, who does the DuPont Circle Farmers Market every Sunday and has people lined up to buy his
Hmm.
flowers. He has a really neat farm in Jeffersonton, Virginia, and he loves the seed pods on the hellebores, which can be very ornamental, and he sells cut hellebores. He was like my first cut flower grower to buy hellebores, and now I work with almost every member of the association, especially cut flower growers, which Bob and Alan Armitage and John Dole at NCSU pretty much started many years ago. And he loves the seed pods, and I do too. Those beautiful swollen appendages, sometimes with a little curly Q at the end of each capsule. They're beautiful.
I agree. And I love having them stay on in the garden for months at a time.
Yeah.
And I would think another thing that makes hellebore such a great garden plant is low maintenance. And I don't believe I've ever fertilized mine. Do you fertilize yours?
I do the ones in pots in the greenhouses, and we grow 100,000 2-inch pots a year, and then they're in the supply chain. Then they get bumped up to 5-inch pots. We also sell bare root divisions to all the cut flower growers by the hundred. But the ones in 2-inch pots, since they're in what we refer to in the nursery business as, and I'm using air quotes, artificial media, because the only thing that's artificial in there is the perlite, because you have in a good perennial mix, and hellebores like a well-drained perennial mix if you're going to grow them in a pot, and in the ground too. They like, and it sounds like a contradiction in terms, rich, moist, organic matter, but well drained. They don't. It's the only way I've ever been able to kill a hellebore is by planting it in a spring or a puddle. So in the pots, we have what, again, here come the air quotes, artificial media, which is basically 65% composted pine bark, which we know is organic, and about 30% peat moss, which we also know is organic, and the rest is perlite, which is a puffed volcanic rock that creates air spaces and helps with the drainage. So even though we refer to it as a inorganic artificial media, it is pretty natural. Now, it has to drain well. So we use what we call a wetting agent, because with all that peat moss in there, peat moss doesn't hold water well. So we use a wetting agent. And when we first transplant them, we use a 9-45-15 fertilizer, which is 9% nitrogen, which creates top growth, 45% phosphorus, which produces roots. That's why it's so heavy on phosphorus, and 15% potassium. And the 45% phosphorus creates really good roots. It's called the plant starter formula. And then after that, we switch off to, and this is liquid fertilizer. Basically, what we do is we'll take 10 pounds of the powdered fertilizer and mix it with 5 gallons of water, and then that concentrate gets proportioned out by a machine in each greenhouse at a ratio of 100 to 1. So they're getting 2,400 parts per million nitrogen. This is way too much information for the average grower. But I mean, this is like a pre-programmed wrap for all the growers that ask me for advice. I just press a button and it just flows out of my mouth. But basically, in answer to your question, the ones in the ground with 6 acres of them, we don't have time to fertilize them. So they're just doing incredible on their own. And even though the soil in my woodlands is a pH of about 5.5, hellebores in their natural habitat grow on limestone. And that's another testament to their wide range of situations, how they'll tolerate anything, because here you have a plant growing in an acid woodland condition that normally grows in a limey meadow. So you can really push the hell out of them, and they reach their limit when you plant them in a running spring or a puddle.
Yep. So extremely widely adaptable to different growing conditions. And as you said before, they can go from part sun to full shade, and take a lot of different abuse, even the occasional foot traffic, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have deer paths all through my hellebores, and that's how I realized that they were completely deer-proof. With 6 acres of them that are not fenced, they've never taken a single bite.
Yeah, and I hear from some of my readers that the hellebore also make good deer beds, that because they can't eat the hellebore, that's where they bed down in.
Well, I do have some pasture for my horses, and they seem to bed down in the lush grass before the hay's put up, more so than the hellebores. And I would think that the hellebores the leaves are very serrated. I would think that the prickly serration would irritate the deer, but who knows?
Well, Yeah, in comparison to
Really.
amongst other plants.
When
Yeah.
they're tired, they're gonna lay down anywhere.
Wanted to talk a little bit about the different Hellebore species, which you had alluded to before and talked about that most of what we're growing in our gardens are the hybrids. But there's the Hellebores Fetidis, which is also called commonly the stinking hellebore.
Oh, I hate
Um,
that. I
so,
hate that. You know what? There's another common name called the barefoot hellebore, bear claw hellebore. Uh, let's stick with that, or let's just call it Hellebore Fetidis. That's the name that Linnaeus gave to it, and that's kind of a bad term also because fetid in Latin means smelly. So
mhm.
I mean, all right, Hellebore Fetidis, the palmate hellebore. You don't know how many people in my garden I fooled and told them it was marijuana because the leaves do resemble marijuana. Now, this is a short-lived plant compared to the Hellebores ex hybridis, which live longer than people do. And the Hellebore fetidis is maybe 4 or 5, 6, 7 years at the most, but they seed around. And there's been several named varieties. The first one that I ever encountered was Miss Jekyll, and that had really neat red stems. But I've found lots of other seedlings, and I found silver ones, and I used to have them all kept separately, and used to keep the seeds separate, and I just said to hell with it, and I let them all mix together. Now you get a really neat variable mix. Now they prefer even better drainage than the Hellebores ex hybridis, and they like a little bit of sun.
And on your website, I was looking at a hellebore I've never grown or encountered, I don't believe, called Lividus.
Okay, well, that's Lividus is a not non-hardy species. It grows in the warmest parts of England well. So what they've done is they've taken Lividus and bred it with Hellebore argutifolius, which used to be known as Hellebore lividus corsicus. So the crossing of Hellebore lividus with Helleborus argutifolius makes Helleborus externii. Then they've taken that externii and crossed it with Niger, the Christmas rose, and that's all the hellebores that you see at Lowe's and Trader Joe's growing in pots
Ah,
that all flower at the same exact time. They were produced by a couple guys who actually came to visit me when I first got started in hellebores, named the Huger brothers in Germany. And those plants are all produced in tissue culture. They were originally bred by a family in England, the Tristams, who were brilliant, brilliant hellebore breeders. And the foliage is incredibly marbled, and the flowers are huge. The plants are kind of short-lived because I think because they're such interspecific crosses. And when I say interspecific, that I mean the term interspecific means between different species in the same genus. So, like I said, you have Hellebore lividus, which isn't hardy, bred with Helleborus argutifolius, which produces Helleborus externii, which is hardy. And then they crossed that back with Helleborus niger and came up with the current strain. I'm trying to think of the names, kind of escape.
hmm.
Ivory Prince, that was the first one.
Yes. I was going to say Ivory Prince and Joseph Lemper, which is
Oh,
probably
yeah,
Joseph Lemper,
yeah.
is another beautiful one you see a lot. And they're usually, again, sold in pots at, local supermarkets and big box stores around
Yeah.
Christmas time.
Well, they're like Easter lilies and Easter cyclamen and things like that. Now that people just toss away azaleas, potted flowering azaleas. They sell them at Walmart or Trader Joe's or something in flower, or Lowe's or Home Depot, and then people keep them for the couple months that they're flowering, and then they pitch them. Of course, they could be kept alive if you wanted to keep dividing them. The Easter lilies can go in a garden I think that's
Hmm.
Lilium formosanum, and it can become a hardy garden plant. The cyclamen are Cyclamen persicum, which people grow for the beautiful flowers, and then the flowers disappear, the foliage disappears, and they have a bulb in there and they think it died and they toss it, or they keep watering it and it rots. If you have a cyclamen, or the true pronunciation is cyclamen, and it's done flowering and loses leaves, just let it stay dry. I mean, that tuber is totally full of water and can last and last and last. If the top of the soil in the pot is bone dry, you give it a little bit of water, maybe every couple weeks or a month, but you don't want to keep the soil wet. And then the following spring, it'll come back and you'll have that cyclamen again. And in fact, you can even collect the seeds from it and grow them on. They germinate the first year and produce a flowering sized plant pretty quick.
Yeah, that's great points. That a lot of things that we consider disposable plants aren't necessarily that. They can be propagated outside or planted straight out, like the supermarket primrose I just bought today. And I usually let them flower until they stop flowering inside, and then I just pop them outside, and they've come back annually for me and bloomed again and again.
Well, they are, one of the varieties of the primula, and I'm still a member of the Primula Society, and hold on a second, I'm waiting till this call stops ringing. There we go. One of the varieties, and I'm trying to think of which one it was. It wasn't. Maybe it's Opconica. It's an annual, or as we say, temperennial, which is
Hmm.
basically a short-lived perennial. Now, if you want to grow some primroses that are perennials, and there's probably over 300 primula species out there, my biggest seller, which is also makes a great cut flower, is Primula japonica. And I
Mm.
have an incredible color strain of Primula japonica that I sell out on every year that is everything from pure white, which used to be from my original strain of one that was developed in England called Postford's White, and another one called Miller's Crimson. And that's what I basically started with, and started breeding the two of them together and coming up with not just crimson and white ones, but grape colored ones and cinnamon colors and reds, and they are just really, really amazing to naturalize. Primula japonica, the Japanese primrose.
I think we're gonna have to do a separate podcast another time just on
Oh,
primroses.
we could do hundreds of podcasts on plants. There's so many plants, so little time.
Exactly. So back to your Hellebore selections. What are you selecting for in the hybrid?
Well, basically, for hybrid vigor, we try to cross pollinate different plants with each other, and I call them the sunshine selections. I've resisted the temptation to give them individual names, and I still, I post a lot on my Facebook page. People want to go to Facebook and look me up. Just look up Glickster and on Facebook, or just look up Barry Glick. And I try to post a different picture of a different plant every day. This is Hellebores. I posted, like I said, the germinating seedlings today. Yesterday, I posted about 10 different spotted flowers. And I think the day before was an anemone centered one. So I try to mix it up. But I basically call them the sunshine selections. And at one point, I did have some individual selections in tissue culture, but they were very slow in tissue culture back in the old days. And I pretty much closed my tissue culture lab down, because nowadays people just like the variety. And especially my cut flower growers, they want variety.
And beside vigor, are you looking for a particular coloration on them? Are you looking for the face to turn up?
No, and that's never going to happen. Well, never say never. That's unlikely. And in my lectures, I first make sure there's no obese people in the audience, and then I say, if there's somebody asks me a question about up-facing flowers, says, "Come on, you've been sitting in the house eating half gallons of Breyer's ice cream all winter. get out there and bend over and pick the flowers up and look at them. You need the exercise.
I think we all do at the end of this winter.
Well, you know what, Kath?
Mhm.
Here's my explanation. Look at the time of year that hellebores are flowering. It's winter. There's sleet. There's snow. There's rain. There's freezing rain. It's brutal. And pollen gets killed by moisture, by wet. Most pollen does. Hellebore pollen does. So the flowers have evolved to be their own little umbrellas so that the pollen stays dry. And when insects come to collect the pollen and take it from one flower to the other, or get the nectar out of the bottom of the flower, which we call nectaries. And that's another point I wanted to make about the sepals. But and also for beekeepers, I have a big market with beekeepers who are looking for early pollen and nectar sources. Well, hell, these things are flowering into January, into February, March, April, and May. I said, what better a pollen source? Because each flower has over 100 anthers, and each anther has 2 pollen sacs, and they open slowly over 6 to 8 weeks. So you have a ever blossoming source of pollen and nectar. Now, people, when they're looking at a hellebore flower, say, oh, that one has very nice petals. They're not petals. The petals are in the center of the flower, and they're aborted in this primitive flower, and they're referred to as nectaries. And the 5 appendages that you're looking at are called sepals. That's except if you're looking at what we call a semi-double, then the nectaries have become petaloid. They're still not true doubles because they have sexual parts.
Well, that's terrific points, Barry, that it is a great pollinator source in that time of year that not much else is blooming out there. And we get a little obsessed with wanting to look at them when we're stuck inside. So, one of the ways that I enjoy my hellebore are to take some of the what you would call flower heads off and float them in a bowl of water. And I find that they last that way for a good 6 weeks or so.
My sentiments exactly, and it's nice to use a little packet of floral preservative that comes with bouquets from the supermarket, and you never used it all. Uh, I'll use half of a packet and then store the rest of it and use it in that water to float the hellebores in there. And yeah, that's a great way to display them because they're looking right up at you.
And I was going to say that another way to enjoy them is to scroll through the selections on your website, which I'm doing right now. So it's sunfarm.com. And then you click on the sunshine selections, and you have dozens. I don't know how many pictures you have. I want to say
You
hundreds.
know what? It's better to look on Facebook because those
Hmm.
pictures are so old. I mean,
Ah,
they're from Ektachrome slides. That's how old they are that I scanned. But the newer pictures are up on Facebook.
still fun to look through all the different ones
Oh
and
yeah, yeah.
all the variability, from spotting to streaking to dark burgundy that's almost black to the, pale, pale, pale ones. Um, it's just a great, very variable flower, which I guess when you have the seedlings that you're raising, is each one a surprise?
Yes, yes. Oh, that's the greatest thrill of all is seeing one bloom for the first time.
And from seed to bloom, how long is that?
3 to 5 years.
So a little bit of an investment. It's not like growing annuals or vegetables.
That's how we gardeners kind of try to fool the angel of death because we have so many unfinished projects going on that I think the angel of death says, "Oh, we'll wait another year or two for that guy. He's got he's got some stuff he's waiting on." So, and you see, most gardeners live a long, long life. I think it's because it's a combination of well, here, especially in the mountain state, West Virginia, hiking up and down hills because I have gardens at different levels and different elevations all over the farm. But also, most gardeners are pretty healthy, health oriented, very conscious people. Wouldn't you say?
And it's, yeah, a lifestyle that lends itself to the healthy. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, but then it can also make you more healthy by pursuing
Yeah.
it.
Just look in the mirror, Kath.
Out there. So thank you so much, Barry, for letting us pick your brains about everything Hellebore. Any last thoughts to leave our listeners with?
You know me, I can talk all day, but I'm getting hungry and thirsty. So, and I got to go put some wood on the furnace and make sure that the house is nice and warm tonight and go for a little hike.
Sounds like a lovely winter evening. I thought I'd share a little bit about a big project I've been working on for several years, and that's National Seed Swap Day. I started National Seed Swap Day back in 2006 as part of the promotion for our Washington Gardener Magazine annual seed exchanges. And I had it named an official holiday for the last Saturday of January every year. After that event's success the first year, seed swaps in other cities started to be added to it, and we started a National Seed Swap Day website called seedswapday.com, and you can find seed swaps all across the nation and now in other countries as well listed there. Of course, this year due to COVID, a little bit of wrinkle in there, in-person seed swapping, maybe not the best idea, but we're going to explore that. And what we're going to do is have a live session on YouTube and Zoom on Seed Swap Day itself. This year it's January 30th, a Saturday, of course, and it'll be from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'm going to have special guests, seed experts. We're going to talk about everything seedy, and we are going to talk about how you can safely have a seed swap in a pandemic, and other ways that you can swap seeds if you cannot safely get together. So I hope you'll join me for that, and we will have details on how to do so at seedswapday.com shortly. And happy gardening. Plant profile, Smooth Hydrangea. Smooth Hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens, is a native shrub that blooms from late spring through summer. Typically, the flowers emerge green in color, then turn white before they fade to brown. Newer introductions have added shades of pink to the color selections available. These include Invincible Ruby, Invincible Mini Mauvette, and Invincible Spirit. Some favorite new varieties include the Invincible Wee White Hydrangea, a dwarf selection that gets only about 2 feet tall. The best known smooth hydrangea is Annabelle, with its enormous blooms, but it does tend to droop from the heavy flowers, so look instead for the improved Incrediball at your local garden centers. They are deciduous, and unlike the mophead hydrangeas, Hydrangea macrophylla, you cannot change their flower color by adjusting the soil pH. They prefer part sun to full sun locations. It is a good idea, though, to give them protection from the harshest afternoon rays. These plants need well-drained but moist soil. Add mulch around their root zones to keep the soil moist during dry periods. Fertilize in early spring before the new growth starts to appear with a slow-release fertilizer that is designed for woody plants. You should then prune them back by trimming 1/3 of the total length of the branches. As these shrubs bloom on new wood, this will serve to strengthen the plant's stems and encourage lots of blooming in the growing season. Smooth hydrangea, you can grow that. Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter by going to anchor.fm/Kathy-Gents/support. For as little as 99 cents a month, you can become a listener supporter, and we'll give you a shout out in a future episode.
Another way to support GardenDC is to go to WashingtonGardener.com and subscribe to Washington Gardener magazine. You can find Washington Gardener online at WashingtonGardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.